please help us to seek wisdom, help us to find wisdom, to discern what wisdom looks like lived out in our lives, and also to have the humility to know that there's a lot that we don't know and a lot that we won't know. But thank you for this time that we've had to learn wisdom from your word and from each other. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, just to remind you, or if you weren't here, where we've been in this series. We've talked about King Solomon's place in the book of Proverbs, how the book is connected with him overall as a kind of authority figure behind the book, this representative, wise figure, but also that we've seen wisdom from other figures in the book. We've seen the wisdom of the wise. Last week we talked about the words of Agur, the wisdom of Agur. Today we'll see the wisdom of Lemuel's mother. And so we've had some other figures there's a bit of a wisdom dialogue, I think, in the book of Proverbs. And we talked about wealth and poverty in Proverbs as a way, especially to think about how we interpret Proverbs in general. That Proverbs can't be read as straightforward promises or guarantees. So these ideas that wisdom is connected with wealth, or hard work is connected with wealth. It's not some kind of promise or guarantee. We see some things that complicate that a little bit in the book of Proverbs, and also an emphasis on caring for the poor as well. We talked about Proverbs and ancient Near Eastern wisdom, and how we see various Near Eastern, especially ideas and texts, especially probably the Proverbs of Amenemope, the Egyptian text, show up in Proverbs, and use that as a way to think through how we incorporate wisdom from other traditions in our life as well. And last week we talked about humor and humility. We saw that laughter is mentioned in different contexts in the book of Proverbs. Some are positive, kind of joyful laughter. Some are negative, a little scornful laughter or foolish laughter. But also the idea that humor is used to make a point. It's used to kind of poke fun at human foibles, at human pride, and to encourage humility, which is, I think, just a key piece in biblical wisdom literature. And so today we're wrapping up with women and wisdom. As I said, this is a way to look back at this figure of woman wisdom, and then her kind of counterpart, the wife of noble character, the valiant wife, the wife of strength, the woman of strength at the end of the book. So this is a question I've asked every week, and I think it especially works well this week. What does wisdom look like in my everyday life? As we'll see when we look at this Proverbs 31 woman, I think of her as just one example of what it looks like to live a wise life, as just a concrete wise life lived out. And not everyone's life is going to look like hers, of course, in the ancient world or in the modern world. But she just gives us kind of one model of wisdom lived out. And so I hope we can all think about what wisdom lived out looks like in our context. I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about this as we're wrapping up after 5 weeks, things that you've been thinking about in terms of what wisdom looks like in the world today or in our lives, or questions or things that that have come up for you over the last few weeks. It's fine if nobody does. Jonathan.
I'm struck by the situational nature of wisdom. It's like you have to be thoughtful about it. It's not one size fits all. And so just thinking about how does that work? It's not like you just do whatever you want, or kind of situational ethics or something. So it's like there's some, not quite able to articulate it, but just it's like you have to kind of, I've heard the analogy, like controlling this borderline. You're kind of constantly like answering the fool according to his folly, don't answer the fool.
Right. Yeah, Jonathan noted that wisdom is very situational, and that's something, that I was trying to bring out in the wealth and poverty thing. And you mentioned the Proverbs about answering a fool according to his folly, not answering a fool according to his folly. You have to figure out what situation is right for answering a fool or not answering a fool. And I think that's the thing about wisdom, is that you can't really boil it down to like 5 easy steps to being wise. It just doesn't really work that way. And it's always this process of discernment. Yes?
And then kind of related to that kind of goes, I get older too. I think wisdom is just, it's inherently, it has to be kind of gained through lived experience. I think it's hard to just pick up a book and read it, and
So it has to be gained through lived experience, and probably also from listening in community. That's something that I've thought about, and that I think, as I said, that this kind of wisdom dialogue that we have in Proverbs among Solomon and the wise and Lemuel and Agur, and even with kind of an implicit dialogue with other parts of Scripture and other non-biblical texts, is a way to emphasize that idea too. Yes, Steve?
The Apostle Paul uses these three words several times in his letters: wisdom, knowledge, understanding. And he puts them together. There are three of them that just run together. And I'm wondering if wisdom is separate from knowledge, from understanding. It appears that is what Paul is emphasizing. But you've got to have all three. And particularly when you're going to resolve a conflict, because that's when he brings these words out. So it just is rather exciting to the brain to begin to think about it.
Right.
And he would be familiar with wisdom literature.
Yep. And you gotta ask my colleague Dr. Jason Myers more about if you want to talk about Paul. But yes, there are all these wisdom terms that kind of overlap in terms of their meaning, but do have different shades, and all are important. All right, so just at the beginning here for a couple minutes, we won't spend a lot of time here, but I want to talk about good women and bad women in Proverbs 1 through 9. We've already seen some of these figures. So if you were here, already a couple times we've looked at this idea of wisdom personified as a woman. We see her doing various things. So she's out on the streets calling for people to listen. So she's not hidden, she's not some kind of mystical figure exactly. She's out there like a prophet saying, listen to me, everybody who's foolish, turn aside from your ways, and come listen to me. And then we have that important theological passage where wisdom is with God at creation and rejoicing in God's created world, rejoicing in humankind, and this idea that wisdom is kind of part of the fabric of the created world as God has made it. So she's this important figure. And in Proverbs 1 through 9, she's contrasted with woman folly. In one passage, folly is personified as a woman. So that this folly character doesn't have a huge role, but we do see one passage with woman folly. And she's also contrasted with this person called the strange woman. This is someone we haven't really talked about, but she appears in several passages. She plays quite a big role in Proverbs 1 through 9. Strange, it's a lot of times used to refer to foreigners in the Bible, like a stranger. It's not clear if this woman is a foreigner. Most of the time, at least in some of these passages, she's depicted as an adulterous woman, and she's kind of going around the streets, just like woman wisdom, but trying to grab unsuspecting young men and lead them to her house. Here's just one passage about her. For the lips of a strange woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps follow the path to Sheol. That's like the underworld. She does not keep straight to the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. And there's even, if you look at some of these passages, even longer descriptions of her and all the lengths she's going to ensnare these naive young men. And so she's contrasted, obviously, with woman wisdom, and so we have this kind of good woman, bad woman dynamic here in Proverbs 1 through 9, which we'll see kind of it'll return. We'll see hints of that in Proverbs 31, although it's mostly good woman there. So this figure, I think she's really associated with death, and sometimes even it's not really metaphorical. It's like the idea is that if a young man is seduced by her, then her husband is going to kill him. So that it's not, like I said, it's not just a metaphor, although it might be also. But maybe she represents a kind of just general temptation, and this book, at least at the beginning of it, is really directed towards young men. It keeps talking about listen to your father, listen to your mother, and the book being directed at young men who are kind of starting to embark on their own in a way. Makes sense that that we would have this as the figure of temptation. At the same time, it can be a little uncomfortable, I think, sometimes for me to read these passages, especially some of these long ones, because things like this have fed into this idea that women that have kind of out of control sexuality, or that they're the women connected with death, femme fatale, and stuff like that. So it's probably wouldn't go over so well in our context necessarily, but like I said, people have always read her for a long time as being more than just about adultery or something like that. That she's kind of representative of these kind of temptations that people would encounter. And I think her counterpart, she in a way is a kind of manifestation of woman folly, like a real life woman folly, and what we'll see in Proverbs 31 is like a real life woman wisdom. So you have these two figures, woman folly and her incarnation, the strange woman, and then woman wisdom, her incarnation, the noble wife, the noble woman. All right, so we're gonna, as I said, a lot of things from Proverbs 1 through 9 show up towards the end of the book. We saw that last week with Proverbs 30 as well, and so that's why I show you these kind of two figures of wisdom, of women that come back again at the end of the book. We'll spend most of our time today on Proverbs 31, and here we see two parts of the text, and there's a handout that hopefully everybody has, and if you're watching along online, it's just Proverbs 31. So first, it's the wisdom of Lemuel's mother in verses 1 through 9 that we'll take a look at, and then this poem about the woman of strength in the rest of the chapter. So first we'll take a look at verses 1 through 9 and talk about this part together, and then we'll go on to the poem that closes the book. So just to remind you, this chapter follows on, if you were here last week, the words of Agur in chapter 30. And so Agur is this unknown figure. He starts out by saying he's weary, he doesn't have wisdom, he's a beast. And then we see what I think is a kind of a bit of a critique of kingship at the end that we saw with the images of the animals that are the wisest, and then the animals that walk proudly around, starting with the lion and ending with the king. So that's and this critique of pride that really ends that, or that is through that whole chapter. So now when we open up Proverbs 31, we have this other collection attributed to Lemuel. It says the words of King Lemuel. We don't know who this figure is. So Lemuel probably means belonging to God. But we don't know who he is. It says an oracle that his mother taught him. It's also possible that the word oracle could be a place name called Massa, which is in the kind of east area. So it's possible that this is a foreign king if we read it one way. If it's an oracle, that's a link with what we saw with the words of Agur, also are called an oracle. But here we have his mother taught him this. So we have the words of his mother, really. It's attributed to him in some way, but he's just kind of repeating the things that his mother taught him. So at the beginning of the book, we have this figure of a father teaching his son. My son, listen to your father's teaching. But we also have, it says in chapters 1 through 9, listen to your mother as well. So now we have this king figure listening to his mother, which is kind of interesting. Kind of bracketing the father's wisdom and the mother's wisdom. And even interesting that, this presumably adult king is still listening to his mother and repeating her words. So this is her wisdom. She says, no, my son, no, son of my womb, no, son of my vows. Do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. So this is the end of this unit, and there's a few things I think we can talk about. Any responses to what you heard here, questions, reactions?
It's sort of the first AA meeting.
In what way? In what way? Oh, don't drink wine. Yeah. Although presumably AA doesn't promote poor people drinking wine, but yeah. Any other observations or thoughts? Yes, Kristen?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, coming from his mom, it's not very positive about women.
Yeah.
Don't give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings, like in the same sentence.
Right. Yeah, I think we kind of have a return of the dangerous woman here. Joseph.
Question.
Yeah.
Are we dealing with the Middle East, like the Middle Eastern or very common harem system in this passage? Or, because if it's the harem system, then it's completely obvious. If you, like, I don't know if you've ever read things like Anna the King's Diane, where the king's a bunch of brides and they're all skating for whose son is going to be the next king. And it's a real mess. And
Yeah, that's a good question, especially in light of the Solomon figure who's behind this book. And if there is a bit of a critique or kind of playing with that Solomon figure, like we talked about last week. Solomon supposedly has 1,000 women in his harem, and they end up being his downfall because they led him to worship other gods. And so there may be a critique of that. I think she's not necessarily condemning all women, I don't think, but there definitely is this idea of at least some women they can destroy kings. And interesting, like Kristen said, coming from his mother, so we have kind of both the good woman, bad woman trope right here. Mm-hmm.
It also seems to me that some of this might be kind of read as being really specific advice for a ruler. Basically saying you have such great responsibilities to everybody.
Right.
You can't be distracted by women or wine or anything else. You've got to be focused on your job and helping people.
Right. I think you're right. Yeah. It's a strong contrast between him, not drinking wine, being careful about women. Others maybe don't have to be as careful because they're not rulers. And I do think the rhetorical force is it's a instruction to him. It's not really like, go like a policy of going to give poor people beer or something like that. It is that he has more responsibility, and yes, he needs to be more careful, and kings in general. And I think that follows well from some things in Proverbs 30 about the importance of humility. That kings of all people are going to probably be the ones among the most susceptible to pride and overweening power. And so she's kind of putting him in his place. That kings, especially, and rulers have a lot of responsibility. Dean.
Is there a contrast there between let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more as a ruler, and then speak out for those that are depressed and so forth?
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important. So she tells him, don't get caught up in women and drinking, and then don't just let poor people drink. That's not really the ultimate, policy that's going to be successful. What he really needs to do is speak out for those who can't speak, for the destitute, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. So ultimately, that's much more of his responsibility than anything else. I think, in that ultimately, the things she says maybe about self-control at the beginning are ultimately directed towards that. Don't get distracted. That she says that explicitly, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed. So their responsibility is bringing justice for the poor and the afflicted. And if he's distracted by other things, he can't do that. And so ultimately, all the advice, I think, is towards speaking out for the poor and needy.
And can you say anything about the difference between righteousness and justice? To judge righteously, and the parallelism in the Psalms between righteousness and justice. Is there a distinction? Because there's two Hebrew words for both of those, isn't there?
Right. So Dean is asking about the distinction between righteousness and justice. It's usually like tzedek and mishpat, the pair in Hebrew. They're closely related. I think, righteousness, I've heard it described as, it's not, in the Bible, it's not just kind of an abstract, like being, a good person or something. It's kind of like being in the right position, right relationships with those in the community. And in Mishpat, justice is giving people what they deserve. And so it could be justice if somebody does a crime, then they deserve to, repay what they've stolen, for example, or be punished for what they did. But if someone had something taken from them, justice is restoring them to the position that they should be in. So I think they're closely related, and it can't necessarily be separated. And the fact that they're used as a pair is probably deliberate. But they do have a bit of a different shade of meaning, maybe. I don't know, Jonathan, any more to say about that?
No, I don't think I could say it any better than that. Yeah, only that I'm reminded of what was said earlier about what Dean was saying. He was about wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and he was thinking too in terms of the Testament model is like virtue. It's like what's the difference between? Again, I want to ask Jason here. What's the difference among all those terms for like positive behavior?
Yeah.
There's a lot of overlap, and if you look at English translations, sometimes there's just different words.
Right. I will say, just, like I said, it's sometimes those words become just kind of religionese, especially something like righteousness, but it's really concrete and lived out, like I said, right relationships, treating people right, giving people what they deserve. It's not like an abstract, just like thinking the right thoughts or, that kind of thing in the Bible. So, go ahead, sorry.
Just on verse 3, what does strength mean? Do not give your strength, because we're going to move to verse 10 that talks about, woman of strength. So
yeah, that's a great observation. So you see that word strength there in verse 3. Then you see it in verse 10, a woman of strength. And then it's actually, you're not going to see it, but in verse 29, it says, many women have done excellently. It's the same word, chayil. So you see that word chayil at the beginning, and then at the beginning of this next section, and then at the very end of it. Chayil is a word that it means strength in any area. Like it can refer to wealth. So somebody can be like a man of like strength. It means that he has a lot of resources. It can mean physical power, and sometimes even refers to like an army. So it can be military might. It can also refer to character sometimes. So I do think here it's not actually clear what it means to. It has such a wide variety of meanings that give your strength to women. It could be his energy. It could be his attention. It could be even his resources. Because you can imagine if you're supporting a harem, you would be spending a lot of resources on a lot of women, and maybe not have the resources to dedicate to, bringing justice to the poor and needy. And I think it is interesting that the mother says to him, "Don't give your strength to women," and then in verse 10 you have this woman of strength, the kind of this counterpoint, and it does, I think, also shows like this don't give your strength to women can't be read as like, well, every woman is some kind of woman of death, bad news woman. There are women of strength. They might be hard to find, as verse 10 implies, but they are out there, and there are women who are strong and valiant and of good character. So that's just kind of this interesting contrast.
Because I was wondering if it was that strange temptress, if that basically meant having physical contact with women.
Right. I mean, yeah, it could be like your energy, your vitality, and that, and attention. Yeah. Yeah. Jonathan.
Just a little thing. I don't know if this is relevant or interesting, but in verse 9, that word, so judge righteously, yes, shakot sedek, so it's those words.
Yeah.
Mishpat, so they're talking about that word for judge, I mean that's the word for the judges in the book of Judges, who are
Right.
military leaders more than like judicial figures, and of course it is the word for like judgments in the judicial sense all over the place too. It's probably more primary in the main usage. But anyway, I'm just wondering if
that's an interesting point, because there's actually some more kind of military martial language in the Woman of Strength poem too, and I wonder if there's kind of a lot of this language is used that often refers to military might to say, well, this is real Chayil. This is what real strength looks like. It looks like a king who is not necessarily a military leader, but a king who's speaking out on behalf of the poor. It looks like a woman who's supporting her community. And so that military language is maybe clustered in this whole chapter to say, like, you think you know what strength and might is? Like, these are two pictures of what it looks like. Joseph and Jason.
Is the woman of strength part still part of Lemuel's mother's teaching, or is it some separate thing?
That's a great question. I think I would say yes and no. Usually when you have a heading on something, I take everything from the heading on to the next heading as part of that unit. And so I do think there's this, and same with, it's a very similar situation with the words of Agur. There's a part at the beginning of chapter 30, the words of Agur, from the opening of it to his prayer in verse 9, that really looks like a unit. Similarly to here, this really looks like a unit at the beginning, and so in some sense we could say, well, just verses 1 through 9 is the words of Lemuel's mother. But having this here at the end, and there's no other heading in the book, because this is the last chapter of the book. In some sense, I do think it falls in the unit, the section of Lemuel's mother's words. Did you have a follow-up?
Lemuel's mother contrasting spending too much time and attention on women on the wrong kind of woman with a lot of advice to Lemuel about finding a good wife.
Yeah, that's one way you could read it. Yeah, that you're contrasting the bad kind of woman with the good kind of woman. Jason.
This might be a little bit out of left field. So
Thank you.
Don't take it badly. So preface that. This kind of reminds me a little bit of the story of Samson. I mean, certainly one of the more famous stories of a man and woman giving way.
Yeah, literal strength.
And there's judging, there's not drinking. Which
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
And in some sense, kings, I guess, would probably be like kind of super judges, right? They're kind of the pinnacle of that. I just don't know if there's ever been any connection between these stories.
Yeah, so right. So Jason's pointing out a connection between these words and Samson's story. That's something to definitely look into. It's not something I've come across before, but you do get that idea, and it's literally his strength is destroyed by a woman, and also he has previous run-ins with women earlier in the story, and then he's not supposed to drink also, and he does. Well, his mother said she's not supposed to drink, but then he goes to a drinking party, and that's where he has the riddle, and anyway, it's really interesting. Maybe I'll have to. I'll let you know if I come across something like this. Did you have something?
I was just noticing the change in the plural women to a woman, and so it kind of, for me, tracks with what this person just shared about, like, don't get caught up in the many, like, find the one, you know, or find the one that's worthy of you, and that will, like, come alongside you, or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's like that in the original text, the plural and singular.
It is. Yes, that's true. That's a good point. One thing I'll just note as a bit of a preview to this woman of strength is that you end this text with defend the rights of the poor and needy. Those words are the same words used in verse 20 about the woman that we'll see. She opens her palm to the poor. She stretches out her hand to the needy. So you see the same poor and needy pair, and also that connection with strength. It seems like these have been deliberately coordinated, whether they were originally separate pieces or not. Yes?
As we already heard mentioned, obviously this is a king looking for a wife, so a queen. What do we know about the roles of queens kind of in ancient Israel? I mean, we don't get a lot of good stories about queens as I think about it. But what is kind of like their sphere of why we can do this type of wife to be a queen versus...
Yeah, so Jason's asking about queens, the role of queens in ancient Israel. I think, on the one hand, we should think about this royal setting because it's set up like this. On the other hand, like, the woman of strength is clearly not, she's not really a queen because her husband is sitting with the elders at the gate, and I think the whole book, like, we're supposed to kind of think beyond the royal setting. On the other hand, yeah, we do have, I mean, there's limited stuff about queens. They're often bad. I mean, Bathsheba, she's kind of involved in a semi-sketchy conspiracy with the prophet Nathan to get Solomon on the throne. On the other hand, God loves Solomon, seems to be the plan anyway, so, but it's a little shady. There's Jezebel, of course, the famous Phoenician queen who brings Baal worship to Israel. And there's one queen who rules, Athaliah, who's really bad. So, but you do sometimes see references to the queen mother. That seems to be like an official role, the queen mother. So that would be the mother of the king. Not a lot in Israel, but she does seem to have like a position. So there's not a lot of details, but I do think you do see in some cases queens have some influence for good or bad, and also the queen mother has some influence for good and bad in certain cases. So they're definitely a factor. Jeremy?
I apologize for walking in late, so maybe you address this and then you can say, I said that. Talking about the queen mother, like the queen mother is the writer here.
Right.
And so do we know anything about that person, like her name or what her background was?
Yes. No, we don't. So we don't even know who this Lemuel is. He's not an Israelite king or a Judite king. Like, so he's someone from outside of Israel. And so we don't know the mother either. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting when we think about, in terms of writing and authorship. Here we do have a text essentially authored by a woman, and we don't see that very much in the biblical text. There may be biblical texts that are authored by women, either written down by women or passed along by, transmitted by women. They're composed by women. And we have like songs in the mouths of women that are presumably composed by them, like Deborah's song. But we don't have a lot of hints about that. But there is, we do see in some ancient Eastern cultures, there are sometimes women scribes who are mentioned, and you would think that women in like a royal setting might have more of an education. And so I think it's not inconceivable to think that also in Israel, like women could have been involved in the production of text. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but that's an interesting point to me, that we don't see a lot of hints about women being involved in text authorship and production, but it could be the case in Israel. All right, why don't we go on to the next part of the text, the woman of strength. I wanted to show you this text. It's a poem, and it has a form of alphabetic acrostic. This might not mean much to all of you, but it means something to some people. I know we have some Hebrew scholars in the room, including somebody from my Hebrew class last semester. So there's a few texts in the Bible, more than a few, that are alphabetic acrostics, which means they start, each line or section starts with a letter, the letter of the alphabet, like the A, B, C, D, E, F. And sometimes it's more than one line. So we have a few psalms that are acrostic psalms, and the most famous is Psalm 119. It's the longest psalm, and that has 8 lines per letter. So if you've read through that psalm, it's extremely long. That's because it has 8 lines for Aleph, 8 lines for Bet, and so on. You see it in a couple other places. So here is one of these places. And if you study Hebrew, you can kind of see here. So this is verse 10. It's written from right to left. So this is the Aleph line. The word woman, Isha, starts with an Aleph. And then the next line is the Beit line. It says Batach, he trusts. That starts with the Beit. And then it goes 22 lines to the end of the chapter to Tav. People don't know for sure what the alphabetic acrostic form is supposed to do. Some people think it's a memory aid or something, but the most frequent explanation of it is that it indicates a kind of comprehensiveness, just like our saying from A to Z. So this is like a kind of representative woman of strength from A to Z. In Lamentation, you could look at Psalm 119 is all about God's Torah, God's teaching, and how great it is. So it's like, an A to Z on steroids in that psalm. The book of Lamentations has 5 poems, 4 of them are acrostics, and it's all about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so it's, that it's this kind of like complete picture in a way of the destruction of Jerusalem. So I think we can think about it that way. So I'm going to read it, and then we'll talk about just people's thoughts and reactions, and then go through it kind of closely. So it says, "A woman of strength who can find? She is far more precious than rubies. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. She rises while it is still night and provides food for her household." And here I'm on the top line, and on the other side, I meant to change the translation. It says, "and tasks for her female servants." Probably a better translation is "a portion." It's the same word that we saw in Agur's words when he says, "Tear off for me the bread of my portion." So probably better not to think of her kind of ordering around her servants, although she probably does that. But she gives food to her household and portions to her servants. "She considers a field and buys it, and the fruit of her hands she plants. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She girds her loins with power and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She stretches out her hands to the distaff and her palms to hold the spindle. She opens her palm to the poor and stretches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid for her household when it snows, for all her household are clothed in crimson. She makes herself coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the city gates, taking his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She supplies the merchant with sashes. Strength and majesty are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come." We looked at that verse last time. "She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her happy, her husband too, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently," that's that word again, chayil, strength, "but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she will be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the city gates." All right, so that's how the book closes. I want to just ask you, first of all, whether you're hearing this text for the first time or you grew up hearing it, how do you feel about this woman? She gets a lot of different reactions, I think, from women and men as well. So is she meant to be a role model for women? Is she burdening women with unrealistic expectations? So women have often felt the need to do it all, and is this another example of that? Is there wisdom for men here? What's your feelings about this?
The thought I actually had, and it goes into the second person at the end, you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if this is like written by a king or by a man saying, like, this is the ideal woman from my perspective, and that could also kind of fit with, setting up these, unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, I mean, is it an ideal woman from a man's perspective? That's one take. Yes, Reed.
I'm just noticing the words servant, the servant's field, vineyard, merchandise,
Yep.
crimson. These are all indications of some wealth.
Yeah, right.
So is she, it would be rare. I mean, she's an exception.
Right.
In a sense,
Right. This isn't an everyday Israelite woman. She has to be wealthy. I mean, many people had servants, probably slave. There's no actually distinction in Hebrew between servant and slave. And the whole system is, of course, different from how we think of modern slavery. But yeah, she has people working for her. She has these expensive things, crimson and these kinds of fabrics that not everybody could have afforded. She has the means to buy fields. Her husband's respected at the gate, the city gate. So yes, she's a person with means, and she's not an everyday kind of person, which I think is something that's important to notice. She, even if you're putting yourself in ancient Israelite shoes, she never could have really been a model for every woman, because she's not really an every woman. Yeah.
It's so much of it is focused on like the home and taking care of the husband and the children.
Mm-hmm.
But it did stand out to me that she's also able to like buy real estate.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. She does buy real estate. She sells her clothes. She's an entrepreneur in a way. So she's making her clothes, sells them. That's in verse 24. She discerns about a field and she buys it. There's no suggestion that she has to go through her husband or anything. She's making choices about buying the field and planting a vineyard. And so she's a wine producer also, presumably. Yeah, Jason.
This is, I think, I know you're familiar with the work, but Carol Meyer's work, Women in the Ancient Near East.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on some of our misconceptions that we might have based on, I guess, the Western experience of women, and how do we put too much on the ancient world and say, well, it was identical to what was practiced here, or what would be the exceptions?
Right. I think, I do think sometimes, especially if you're talking about conservative Christian circles, we do have this kind of idea of a woman, and especially a kind of a biblically guided woman, as somebody whose domain is the home, and they're taking care of their family. But in the ancient world, the home wasn't the same kind of place. For one thing, you have extended families living at home. Everybody was working, so I think there's no such thing as like a, really, there's not such a distinction between like a working mom and a stay-at-home mom. Like everybody worked, men and women worked, probably children worked. Everybody was working, in the home. Especially a lot of people were farmers, at least at certain parts in Israel's history. So a lot of people are like subsistence farmers. So everybody's going to be doing their things, and there were some tasks that tended to be more in the domain of women, grinding flour, clothing production, that maybe getting water, things like that. But everybody was involved with agriculture. Everybody was involved in the food system in some way, probably. And I'm not saying all through Israel's history, but everybody was working. And also homes are places of production in ways that they're not today. So this is something Ellen Davis, who's a biblical scholar, has pointed out, that like right now, for the most part, homes are places of consumption. So we buy things and we consume them. But in ancient Israel, homes are places of production. They're making clothes, they're making food. And so it's just kind of, I do think it's an important distinction, as Jason points out, that we can't really map out our present world or, the 1950s or something and put it onto what households look like in the ancient world. Because obviously she is caring for children, she is making food, she's making clothes, some of the things that we might associate with traditional women's roles. But the roles weren't this. We can't map on what we might have in our heads of traditional women's roles to the ancient world. Yes?
Putting this in the context of the whole prophetic word and so forth, any chance that this could be somewhat a personification of Israel?
Oh, that's interesting. So Dean's asking if this could be a personification of Israel. Definitely it has been interpreted allegorically throughout Jewish and Christian tradition. I have seen, I'm not sure if I've seen references to Israel that maybe has happened. It probably has been interpreted that way. I saw references, the idea that in Jewish tradition that she represented the Torah, and we know that figure of woman wisdom is equated with the Torah in Jewish tradition in certain ways. So that if this is it, she also could, since she's associated with woman wisdom, she could be associated with the Torah. In Christian tradition, she has been interpreted allegorically as Mary or the church, so kind of along those lines. I do think on the one hand we could see her as like a bigger, representing something bigger than a person, and in terms of like, somebody who is following God, she's living out her life, and in a way we could see that as a figure for the church, for example, or the nation of Israel at its best, or something like that. On the other hand, I think I like how specific it is in kind of as a contrast to woman wisdom, who is this personified wisdom figure, and she's clearly a kind of, she's clearly not a real person. This person is, I think, meant to be read on one level as a real person. She's out there working in the world, so I wouldn't want to kind of lose that like concreteness of her, even if we can see kind of wider allegorical type of meaning here. Yeah.
To just follow up on what Dean was saying, the allegorical provides us with an ideal. Mm-hmm. And this seems to be a series of ideals
Yeah.
that she has engaged in and becomes a personification of. But when you come to the end, there's this dramatic conclusion. But the woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. So all of this can be commentary, it can be ideals, but ultimately, this is the identity of the woman. It's not derived from the ideals.
Yeah, yeah. And she, as I've already said, she's a complement to woman wisdom. She's wisdom in action. I think of her like an incarnation of woman wisdom. And she's not the only way that wisdom could be lived out, but she's one way. She's clearly connected with that figure. So just a couple points on this. It says at the beginning, she's more precious than rubies. Echoes this similar language. It's not actually, there's a bit of a difference in Hebrew, but in chapter 3, verse 15, it's talking about woman wisdom says she's more precious than rubies. So clearly, she's meant to echo this woman wisdom. And beyond that, she embodies values that are taught throughout the whole book of Proverbs. So hard work, planning, generosity, wise speech, fear of God, as you pointed out, Dean. She is a kind of example of a lot of these values. So we see in a lot of ways that she's wisdomly lived out. Jonathan, did you have something?
Yeah, but Janice, I think.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Just go back to that first question.
Yeah.
Does it text burden women? Yeah, I think what Jason was saying, the context of what our culture is today, but how it's been used. And I'm a child of the 70s and 80s of the James Dobson, this is what a woman should do, stay at home, breastfeed, homeschool, quiverful, make your bread, sourdough. And my experience has been that, well, wait a minute, yes, then I think there's an unrealistic expectation on the man, because if you want me to do all this, you better be out there hustling and making enough money so my servants and if you can buy me a dishwasher, and privately Christian educate my 7 kids. And so that's the contrast I felt in when this is thrown into, be happy when you get up, and make sure you look good and arrive, with my home cooked meal with a happy face. So I think that's where, then I've always struggled with what is the male expectation, because you better work hard enough or do enough that I can meet this unrealistic expectation.
Right, and I think neither of those views that are put forward about biblical masculinity or femininity are really match up with what we have in the Bible, not even beyond this text. Yes.
It's interesting. I grew up with this, always reading this in a pretty fundamentalist, evangelical kind of a background as a kind of a feminist tract. If you read it in a modern context, it's because it's a strong woman who's doing things. It's not somebody who's mousy and sitting at home under her husband's thumb. But it's, I guess the question that's occurring to me listening to our conversation is maybe we're getting too hung up on the male-female thing. Is the first part there is just turn away from your own pleasures and pay attention to taking care of others, especially the needy and destitute. And here it's about a woman of strength. It could be a man of strength. It's looking at the virtues that are being called for. I think we get hung up when we start looking at, is this the pattern I have to follow as a woman or something or whatever. I don't think it's trying to give us role expectations.
I think that's a really important point, that that we do get caught up too much in the woman aspect of this and kind of the binary woman-man. I have a quote from Michael Fox, who's one of the main scholars of Proverbs, a Jewish scholar, passed away not too long ago. But this is what he says, and I think it's along these lines. He says, "However the woman of strength may fare when judged by modern criteria, the fact is that she excels in the very qualities most important to the sages themselves," so the people who wrote the book of Proverbs. "For them, she's not just an ideal woman, she's an ideal person." So that, it could have been written as a man. it's an interesting that it's a woman counterpart to woman wisdom and bracketing the book like that, I think. But yes, she's not just an ideal for women. I totally agree with that. John?
And if you're going to talk about verse 15, I don't know if you don't have to kind of answer this, but kind of piggybacking off of all that in terms of like, yeah, the gender aspect and just comparing the Proverbs 31 woman with woman wisdom. So I'm particularly thinking of she gives the bread to her house and the portion to her servants. So it's the same words as in the prayer of Og, where she gives prey.
Tariff, yeah.
Yeah, and so don't let me kind of steal the thought if you were doing it.
No, that's great.
So she gives prey and then in a portion. So it's, that's like the daily bread. It's kind of those words are separating the prey and the portion. And then if Jesus is actually alluding to that in the New Testament, gives us their daily bread, I'm just thinking, is there some connection where, okay, you have woman wisdom at the beginning of the book, and then you have this woman figure here who is giving daily bread, as it were, to her house, and then Jesus says, you should pray to the Father and say, give us today our daily bread. And then in Proverbs 8, you have the wisdom is with God at the beginning.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering, kind of, you could get all into like the gender of God and stuff, and it's a whole big topic, but I'm just kind of thinking about these possible connections and just throwing it out there.
Thank you, honey. It is interesting in that cluster in 14, 15, 16 has food, which is literally bread, and then food in verse 15 is literally prey, like an animal would get prey, and that's the same related verb is used in the prayer of Agur when it says, when I translate, tear off for me the bread of my portion, and then that word portion comes at the end of the verse. So it is an interesting echo, and in Agur's case, he's asking God to give him his daily bread, his prey, but she's the one providing for her household, and woman wisdom is closely associated with God, but I think just like we see kind of Jesus is the incarnation of God, and Jesus is God's wisdom, it says that in the New Testament, I wonder if, I don't think she's supposed to be seen as God or something, but she's living out wisdom, and just in the same way we're supposed to imitate Jesus Christ in our actions, in providing food, we might ask God for food, but we also are to provide food for others. That's maybe showing that. But it does use lots of unexpected words, I think. This is just to piggyback off other people's points. She's not what we might think of as a kind of imagined biblical womanhood ideal, which is not actually biblical, I don't think. But we have these words like strength. In verse 11, when it says, he will have no lack of gain, it's literally plunder. The husband will have no lack of plunder. She girds her loins. She strengthens her arms in verse 17. Sometimes that word prey, tariff, that we see in verse 15 is also used in military context, like plunder as well. And so we have all these words that are usually we might think of as masculine, often used in context of war and military strength. And like I said earlier, I think it may be a kind of, used to show not only is she strong, but this is real strength. This is real might. This is real valor, both for her and for Lemuel. It's interesting in verses 19 and 20. This some people point to as kind of the heart of the poem. It's right in the middle, and it has this parallel structure. She stretches out her hands in verse 19, and at the end of 20, she stretches out her hands. And then there's the palms and palms in the middle lines. And I think it's interesting. She's working with the what is this, spinning yarn? I don't know enough about spindles and distaffs to show us how much it removed, but it's interesting that she's working on manufacturing yarn and clothes, and then the first thing she does is outward towards the poor. So she's doing her work with her hands, and then she's stretching that out to help the poor and needy, which is the same thing that Lemuel was supposed to do, help the poor and needy. And also interesting, I think, that she stretches out her hands to the poor and needy before it even mentions clothing her household, herself, and selling her clothes. I'm not sure if that's significant, but I think it's interesting. She's doing her work, she's stretching her hands to the poor and needy. Then it mentions that she clothes her house, she makes herself coverings, she makes garments and sells them. So interesting that right in the heart of this is this idea of her helping the poor. I think, and then that idea of strength comes in at the end, again, in verse 29. One little interesting tidbit is that the last verse here, let her works praise her at the city gates. If you look in the book of Ruth, Ruth 3:11, the only other time that this word chayil, strength, is applied to a woman, they say, Boaz says to Ruth, all the gate of my people, which is this last thing, the city gates, everybody at the gate knows that you're a woman of strength. So it may be that the author of Ruth is familiar with this poem, brings together the first line and the last line, the woman of strength in the city gates, in depicting Ruth as this, as a woman of strength, which is another kind of example of her. Just to note, this I think has been said, she's an idealized picture of what wisdom looks like. She's not the only example or model. So she's not an example to every Israelite woman or every Israelite man. She's just one way of seeing wisdom. And so I think as we're thinking about it, we should recognize that I don't think she's meant to be some kind of ideal of woman who does it all, and all women need their lamp shouldn't go out at night. They should be working all night and rising early and happily, weaving yarn or something. And she's not just an example for women. She's an example for men too, that we all need to think about what wisdom looks like lived out in our lives. And this is one example, and she is embodying these values from the book of Proverbs that we've seen. We're going to embody those values different today, of course, but it's really the same kinds of values that we're trying to do, even if it looks different in our context. And it's really for men and women, both. So looks like we're at time, but if you want to talk about anything else, I'll be around. And thank you for joining me for this series.